لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. Looking at the distinction between Kant's distinction between judgment of experience and judgment of perception. The former, as we saw last time, are objectively valid. The latter are only subjectively valid. So we looked at it, this part in detail last time, but we'll just go through it again to see if there is anything else which we can. So empirical judgments, insofar as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience. Those, however, that are only subjectively valid, call mere judgments of perception. The latter do not require pure concepts of the understanding. So the basic difference between the latter and the former is that the latter has the pure concept of understanding, and the former the former had the pure concept of understanding, and the latter only the logical or empirical concepts, but only the logical connection of perception and a thinking subject. Obviously, for Kant, fundamentally, knowledge consists of judgments consists of two essential things: information and then the synthesis of that information. And synthesis has to be done by a subject, for example. So whether you have judgments of experience or judgments of perception, you do need all these elements: synthesis, information, and this self which does this synthesis. So whether judgment is judgment of experience or judgment of perception, they both require these three elements: 1, 2, and 3. Now this one, you don't have the difference due to this, because that's the same in both types of judgments. So the difference would lie in the type of synthesis and ultimately the type of I. And for now, what we can see is, even though we might have to amend this information, but for now what we can see is, in judgment of perception, you have only empirical self doing the synthesis. So in that sense, in this, the self itself is subject to empirical contingencies and all those things. On the other hand, in judgment of experience, the self which is doing synthesis is not an empirical self. It's not even a logical self, which is both in here. It's something beyond experience but something beyond experience is a real self in a sense, not just a logical self. That's how much we understand. We can gather from what we have read so far. So, empirical judgments, insofar as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience. Those, however, that are only subjectively valid, I call mere judgments of perception. The latter do not require pure concepts of the understanding, but only the logical connection of perception in a thinking subject. And pure concept of understanding is related to what I have called non-empirical self. But the former always demand beyond the representation of sensory institution, in addition, special concepts originally generated in the understanding, which are precisely what make the judgment of experience objectively valid. So that's the basic difference. This concept of non-empirical self and non-empirical understanding and non-empirical and non-logical concepts, that's what makes the difference between objectively valid and subjectively valid. But we did, by objectively valid, so far we understand one more important thing which came up last time, that for Kant, so this basic distinction between objectively valid or objective validity, subjective validity. By objectivity, it doesn't equate objectivity to truth or as things are. But primarily what we nowadays call intersubjective validity. So subjective validity is just subjective, but objective validity is intersubjective validity. It is recognizable by between different subjects, not just intrasubjective. Okay, so the difference, but the form is always, okay, so now this is commentary by Allison. The difference between judgment of perception and judgment of experience, or rather I shall henceforth call them Hume's judgment and Kant's judgment, turns on three key points. I think we covered most of them, but anyway, let's read them again. Number one, the above cited passage indicates, whereas Hume judgment, that is judgments of perception, merely subjectively valid. So we looked at it. Kant's judgment have the objective validity. Okay. Number two, whereas Hume judgment contain a connection of perception in consciousness of my state, that like my empirical self. Kant's judgment contain the connection in a consciousness in general. That's what I today call pure or non-empirical, non-logical self. So I think ultimately we would need to get a very good grip on what this consciousness in general is. An equivalent characterization of the former mode of connection is that the representations are related to a consciousness in one subject only, again in contrast to consciousness in general. Yeah. So consciousness in general probably is intersubjective consciousness or intersubjectively valid consciousness, whereas Hume's judgments, and that's the third point, require merely the logical connection of perception in a thinking subject. So So there is a thin synthesis, otherwise there is no judgment. Even in judgments of perception, Kant's judgment addition a pure concept or pure category. So these are non-empirical, non-logical concepts. So what are non-empirical and non-logical concepts? So that's how much we did last time as well. So probably we just got a bit more grip on that, so we can move on from here. Okay, so although Kant distinguishes between two types of Hume judgments, those that cannot and those that can become Kant's judgment by the addition of a category, I shall not bother by this refinement here. For present purpose, it suffices to note that Hume judgments are basically reports of how some states of affairs appears to a particular observer under certain. So that's empirical. This needs not be limited to how something appears to on a particular occasion, however, since it might well express how a state of affair usually or indeed always has appeared. So empirical concept can be occasional, or there can be empirical generality. So both are in that sense part of judgment, subjectively valid judgments of perception, and not objectively valid judgments of judgments of experience. So for example, so we can think of two types of empirical synthesis. One is a particular here, and the other is general. Like I see a lot of, so I'm looking at the rain or tree and I make a judgment. So this is a judgment of perception, not judgment of experience. And then I might do empirical generalization. It always rains in November in Melbourne, for example, or etc., or some other generalization. What he's saying is they both are empirical judgments. They both are judgments of perception and subjectively valid only, and both are Hume's judgment in that sense. Okay. So the basic difference between subjective and intersubjective is not generalization or particularity, but something else. So this need not, for example, whenever I perceive the sun shining on the stone, I've always perceived that it grows warm. A typical human example of constant conjunction or generalization. This is the point of characterizing such judgment as subjectively valid, and as involving a connection of representation in a single consciousness as contrasted with consciousness in general. So the main difference is between single consciousness. So the main difference is between subjective validity and objective validity is between consciousness, single consciousness, and consciousness in general. Whether this single consciousness make a particular synthesis or general synthesis, that doesn't matter. They're both subjectively valid in this sense. Now, what is general consciousness? That's the key thing. Now, mind you, this general consciousness is not mere logical consciousness. Kant would later call it transcendental consciousness or whatever, something similar. Okay, it has been often noted that such judgments do not conform to the definition of that Kant gave of judgment some 4 years later in the B deduction in Critique of Pure Reason. The second edition, according to which objective validity is a defining feature of judgment as such. So in that sense, Hume judgment won't be judgment at all, but we won't go into that at this point because that's not our main concern. Nevertheless, in the prolegomena, Kant regards Hume judgment as judgment in spite of their lack of objective validity, because they possess the logical and grammatical form of judgments, a point which he makes by noting that they involve the logical connection of perception in a thinking subject, that is, synthesis. More important, as I've already suggested, they are, for Kant, the only type of empirical judgment that Hume, or indeed any philosopher who denies pure concept or consciousness in general, can allow. In short, Kant's view is that without the presence of pure concepts and pure understanding and consciousness in general, there can be no claim of objective validity. Okay, I think that's enough for today. That's good. Okay, we'll continue from here next time, inshallah. It is not that available much. Okay.